This is BBC News with the latest headlines for viewers in the UK and around the world. A major U-turn by the UK government. Its smartphone coronavirus tracing app is put on hold amid doubts that it can do the job properly.
I've got to say on this taking the knee thing, which I don't know, maybe it's got a broader history, but seems to be taken from the Game of Thrones.
The UK's Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab says he has full respect for anti-racism campaigners after he's strongly criticised for his comments. Celebration among young US immigrants as the Supreme Court rules against President Trump's bid to end a programme protecting them from deportation. A flypast of the British Red Arrows and their French equivalent, La Patrouille, in London 80 years after General Charles de Gaulle's famous wartime broadcast.
We meet again, don't know where, don't know when.
And Dame Vera Lynn, the British singer who became known as the Force's sweetheart during World War II, has died at the age of 103. Hello and a warm welcome if you're watching in the UK or around the world. In a major U-turn, the UK government has announced that its smartphone coronavirus tracing app is being put on hold because it isn't up to the job. It was supposed to be up and running in the middle of May, and trials had been taking place. But the UK Health Secretary Matt Hancock has blamed technical barriers for its delay and says the government is now joining forces with Google and Apple to develop an app. But there's no date for when it could be ready. Our health editor Hugh Pym reports.
All eyes were on the Isle of Wight for the trial of a smartphone app, which was set to be rolled out across England and play a central role in charting and curbing the spread of coronavirus. There was even an official publicity video.
The NHS COVID-19 app lets you know quickly if you've come into contact with someone who has symptoms.
But technical issues were revealed in the trial. It was supposed to trace and alert contacts of people who tested positive, but proved not to be effective on all devices. Now it's back to the drawing board with more research to be carried out using different smartphone technology.
You had said that the smartphone app would play a central role in testing and tracing. It's now been delayed. When do you think the app will be involved in identifying and tracing contacts?
We are working on it, is the answer. We're not going to put a date on it, I'm afraid, because I'm absolutely determined that whilst this technology can help, it's got to be working effectively.
Very different from what was said to Isle of Wight residents last month.
I have a simple message. Please download the app to protect the NHS and save lives.
It now won't be launched till the autumn at the earliest, perhaps only for booking tests and reporting symptoms, and possibly never for full contact tracing. The focus now will be on human tracing. If someone tests positive, they'll get an email or phone call asking for details of people they've recently met up with. Since it was launched in England in late May, details of more than 14,000 people who tested positive were put into the system. Of those, around 10,200 were reached and asked to provide contacts, just under 3/4 of the total.
As lockdown has eased, the amount of calls that I've seen sort of over the last few days have increased in terms of the amount of contacts that they're giving me. So, for example, previously I might have had only, let's say, 3 or 4 people that they've actually been in close contact with. That's now doubled to maybe 7 or 8.
But some others who have to follow up the contacts and wish to remain anonymous say they've had little to do.
I went live on the 30th of May. In that time, I have dialed 2 numbers and they were both no answer. I've had no other calls since then.
You've been identified as a close contact of someone who has COVID-19.
In Scotland, more than 700 contacts were traced up till the first week in June. As in England, this will be the way forward for now, rather than with smartphone technology. Hugh Pym, BBC News.
Well, let's go now to our technology correspondent Rory Kettlin-Jones, who broke this story for the BBC. They're not the first country, the UK, to change tack, Rory. I think Germany, Denmark, Italy have all switched from this centralised model to a decentralised model. So what is the UK app, if we ever see it, going to look like?
Well, that's a very good question, and I think there's some doubt as to whether we will ever see it. So they've come a certain way. They found out that the system they're using, because it didn't take advantage of that Apple-Google platform that makes Bluetooth work better, their system, the UK system, just didn't work well. It did not. It was not able to spot Apple's iPhones at all. So in a way now, it's back to the drawing board. They say they're going to use the best of what they've developed so far and the best of what Apple and Google have developed. And it's got to be said that the Apple and Google system, nobody's quite clear whether that actually works very well. The key problem is that this is untested technology, using Bluetooth on phones to measure the distance between people. And there's research, not just from the UK, but from around the world, that says it's not actually, at the moment, a very good way of measuring distance. So it may give you a crude estimate of how many people you've been in close contact with, but you may get a lot of false positives or false negatives.
So Germany changed tack, and yet on Monday they launched their app. And what a lot of people don't understand is why we can't just copy and paste Germany's model for the UK. Why do we have to wait until autumn or the winter?
Well, two things. I mean, an app is far more than just the software. It has to be integrated with your whole health system. For instance, you need to be able to put in the results of a test from your testing process into the app. And secondly, I come back to what I was saying before. We don't know whether Germany's app is actually working. Yes, a few people have downloaded quite a bit. They're quite happy with the number of downloads, but it's still less than 10% of the population. And it's thought that you need 60% of the population to download it to be really effective. And we come back to that thing about how good these apps are at measuring distance. This is basically a huge technology experiment that lots of countries have embarked upon, and nobody's quite clear whether it's actually going to work.
Of course, there have been these concerns over privacy, which is why some governments went down the line of a centralised system. But there'll be a lot of people, won't there, Rory, saying, I told you so. The problem with this centralised system is that if we all go on holiday, as we unlock and we all try to go back to a normal life, is that the app that we're using might not work in France or in Germany or in Italy and vice versa.
Well, that's true, but I think that's a wider problem. France, for instance, has built a centralised app. Its app will certainly not work with Germany, and we're not yet clear that they will work across borders. But countries are concentrating, frankly, on seeing if they work within their own countries first. And I think there's going to be more and more emphasis in the UK and around the world on good old-fashioned manual contact tracing. Because the other question that's not really been answered is what happens when you get an app notification with quite frightening news that you've got to self-isolate for 14 days. Now, there is concern that that just will not really be as impressive to people or as comprehensible to people as a simple phone call. Lots of things flash up on one's smartphone every day. How seriously do you take them?
Rory, good to see you. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
The latest UK figures show that the number of deaths from coronavirus reported in the last 24 hours has risen by 135. It brings the total number of deaths since March to 42,288. Among the victims was a 13-day-old baby with no known underlying health conditions. The 7-day rolling average now stands at 144 in the UK compared to 943 at the height of the pandemic. The French president has been in London today for ceremonies to mark the 80th anniversary of Charles de Gaulle's BBC broadcasts, which urged the people of France to resist the Nazi invasion. President Macron met the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, where they also discussed quarantine rules for people travelling to the UK from abroad. Here's our diplomatic correspondent, James Landau.
Now here is a statement in French of great importance to our French listeners by General de Gaulle.
Vive la France, libre, dans l'honneur et dans l'indépendance.
It was 80 years ago that Charles de Gaulle came to Broadcasting House to make his famous speech, urging the people of France not to give up. The flame of French resistance, he said, must not and shall not die. Charles de Gaulle was a junior general in the French army. He had no authority from his government, which had capitulated to the Nazis. And yet, from his base here in central London, he argued that France had lost a battle but not the war. It was a defining act of leadership in the history of the French Republic. The general's chauffeur in those days was a young Englishwoman. Olivia Jordan, then just 21, had been driving ambulances for the French army. Now 101, she told us how even then she sensed the importance of this imposing Frenchman.
He was very impressive to go. He was tall, good looking, and all this and that. And he always made use of all that, and rather frightened people, I think, and sort of looked down on them, you know.
Such is the importance of the general's broadcast that President Macron made a special trip to London to mark the anniversary, greeted by the Prince of Wales in a guard of honour at Clarence House. Nearby, they paid their respects at the statue of de Gaulle, and the President awarded London with the Légion d'honneur, thanking Britain for giving France a voice for its resistance. Britain, he said, gave Free France its first weapon, a BBC microphone.
Un micro de la BBC.
Then in Downing Street, some socially distanced diplomacy as President and Prime Minister tried to sprinkle some entente cordiale over the issues dividing their countries today, the Brexit negotiations and the COVID-19 quarantine rules. Hoping to match on the ground the unity their air forces showed in the skies. James Landell, BBC News.
Diplomacy not easy in the era of coronavirus. Well, involved in that diplomacy today was the UK Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, who has been heavily criticised for saying the anti-racism gesture known as taking the knee felt to him like a symbol of subordination, and that he thought it came from the TV series Game of Thrones. He later said he has full respect for the Black Lives Matter movement. Here's our political editor, Laura Kuhnsberg.
The pitch became a site of protest, kneeling to show strength and sympathy in the fight for black rights, echoing last night the stance, the anger of protesters around the world and here at home. Yet the full story seemed rather to have passed the Foreign Secretary by.
I understand this sense of frustration and restlessness which is driving the Black Lives Matter movement. I've got to say on this taking the knee thing, which I don't know, maybe it's got a broader history, but seems to be taken from the Game of Thrones, feels to me like a symbol of subjugation and subordination rather than one of liberation and emancipation. But I understand people feel differently about it, so it's a matter of personal choice.
So would you or wouldn't you do it?
Take the knee for two people, the Queen and the Missus, when I asked her to marry me.
There is a broader history. A few years ago, the American football star Colin Kaepernick angered Donald Trump, but inspired supporters by kneeling rather than standing for the American anthem to protest against discrimination. But it's a modern echo of the public prayer of civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King. Labour's less than impressed.
A lot of people in the black community felt very, very let down and hurt by the flippant tone that the Foreign Secretary took this morning. At a time when a lot of people in the black community are grieving over loved ones that they've lost and very, very anxious about the future and really reeling from those images of George Floyd over in America, we've got to see a more serious approach.
The Foreign Secretary wrote later that he has full respect for the Black Lives Matter movement, saying, "If people wish to take a knee, that's their choice, and I respect it," calling for everyone to come together to tackle discrimination. Ministers have said again and again they understand the frustration felt by those who came here and elsewhere to demand an end to racism. But this less than diplomatic choice of words by our diplomat-in-chief adds to the sense of frustration among those who believe the understanding in government is not complete, and that even though there have been years of promises, progress has been far too slow.
Now is the time to get the government's knee off the neck of the Black, African, Caribbean, Asian, minority ethnic communities.
Foreign Secretary, would you like to say anything about the taking the knee issue?
The Foreign Secretary chose not to add any more comment this afternoon. When strong feelings are stirred, perhaps our politicians might be advised to always proceed with care. Laura Kuhnsberg, BBC News, Westminster.
Our political correspondent Ian Watson is at Westminster, and the speed with which he issued a clarification, Ian, on Twitter suggests it was quickly pointed out to him why so many people would be offended by this.
criticisms there, Christian. There was mostly from the opposition politicians, at least publicly. David Lammy, the Shadow Justice Secretary, was making it very clear that this was not just insulting to Black Lives Matter, but in his view also embarrassing for the Foreign Secretary. And one of the most senior black politicians in Britain, Diane Abbott, who used to be the Shadow Home Secretary, was saying, look, this whole thing started when American athletes refused to stand for the national anthem to protest police brutality. So this is a very serious issue, and it seemed to have been dealt with in a flippant way from Dominic Raab. So I think sensibly he didn't comment any further when he was asked to do so, but also got that tweet out making it very clear that he respected people's rights to take the knee, as it were, and he also, from his point of view, made it very clear that he also understood the Black Lives Matter movement. But I think the criticism of the government is, has it responded quickly enough, and does it really understand what some of the protests in recent weeks have been about? The Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, has of course set up a new commission to look at racial inequality. Nonetheless, it was criticised for perhaps being rushed out without a clear remit, and initially with no idea of who the commissioners were. So anything which also shows perhaps a lack of understanding or an ignorance of how this movement came about, I think is potentially damaging to the government at a very, very volatile time.
To be clear, though, Ian, you don't have to take a knee to stand in solidarity with the Black Lives Movement protest, do you? I think what staggers a lot of people is that he thought it came from Game of Thrones. I mean, there's been plenty of news and plenty of coverage about Colin Kaepernick. You only need to look on Google, you know, at the pictures of Martin Luther King going all the way back to 1965.
Well, that's right, and certainly people were not required to take the knee, but it has been interesting that certainly senior Labour politicians have been quick to do so. As you know, Christian, in America, many Democrat politicians have done so as well. So Keir Starmer, leader of the Labour Party, made sure he was pictured doing so when the Black Lives Matter protests were very much in the news. And in addition to that, some police officers as well who are policing those demonstrations did exactly the same thing. But yeah, you're not required to do it. But I think, again, it was what Lisa Nandy, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, said. I think perhaps summed it up. It was the flippant tone of the Foreign Secretary's response. And to be fair, he was on a chat show, a talk show on radio. He probably thought he was getting the tone right, being informal, but nonetheless suggesting he'd only take the knee for the Queen and for his wife, and also believing that the origins of this may have come from a hit TV show rather than from American footballers. I think that's what's raised questions, rather than whether he personally would or wouldn't take the knee.
OK, Ian Watson, thank you very much. Thank you. The US Supreme Court has ruled against the Trump administration over its bid to end a programme that protects hundreds of thousands of young immigrants from deportation. The Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals programme, known by the acronym DACA, was set up by President Obama to protect US-born children of illegal migrants, allowing them to work and claim some benefits. Since 2017, the Trump administration has tried to end the programme as part of the hardline anti-immigrant policy platform the president was elected on. Today, though, the US Supreme Court justices voted 5-4 to uphold lower court rulings that found Trump's attempt to rescind the programme were unlawful. In fact, the Conservative Chief Justice John Roberts joined the court's 4 Liberal judges in finding that the administration's actions were, quote, arbitrary and capricious. Our Washington correspondent Gary O'Donoghue gave us some reaction to the ruling.
A couple of immediate pieces of reaction from the president. One saying, do you think the Supreme Court doesn't like me? And also another one suggesting that this is politically charged, and he referred to it as a sort of shotgun blast in the face of Conservatives and Republicans, and then made an appeal to increase the size of the Supreme Court, which is something that's been floated many times before, because at the moment it's 9 justices, and some people on both sides, in fact, think one way of getting their own way on that court would be to increase its size. So second blow in a week, this, Christian, for the president in terms of the Supreme Court. You'll remember that other decision which prevented federally prevented employers from discriminating against gay and transsexual people. So in a sense, the culture wars have taken a bit of a battering this week in terms of those Conservatives out there, which will represent some of Donald Trump's base.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth saying, isn't it, that over 90% of the DACA participants have a job. Nearly half of them are in school. Many don't speak the language or know the culture of their supposed home countries because they were born in the United States to these undocumented migrants. So what does it mean for them, Gary? Is this it? Is that the end of the trouble that they were facing, or could the administration do something else?
Well, it's probably worth noting that the Supreme Court has made a decision based on infringement of statute. I don't want to get too technical about it, but this is not a sort of constitutional right in the sense that it's enshrined for those people on the DACA program to remain in the country. So, in theory, Congress, as it could even with the Constitution, could pass a piece of legislation that says, right, we're going to deport these people, and if it gets voted into law and signed off by the president, then it becomes the law of the land. So in that sense, they're not absolutely secure. We'll see what the Department of Justice says about the status of those who are currently in the country, and you're looking at maybe 600,000 at this kind of case. And interestingly, whether or not new applications will be allowed to the programme, i.e. people that have grown up since the suspension of the new applications back in 2017.
Gary O'Donoghue there in Washington. Dame Vera Lynn, the singer known as the Force's sweetheart to millions of British soldiers during the Second World War, has died at the age of 103. The Prime Minister said her voice lifted the country in its darkest hours and will live on for generations to come. Robert Hall looks back at her life.
There'll be bluebirds over.
It is a voice that has spanned the decades. The voice of an ordinary London girl born at the end of the First World War who became an iconic symbol of the Second. Vera Welch, daughter of a plumber and a dressmaker, began singing as a child. She took her grandmother's surname Lynn as a stage name, made her first record aged 19 and sold 1 million records in the next 3 years.
This little girl from East Ham would never have had the opportunity if she hadn't have been singing. If my mother hadn't put me on the stage.
This letter of mine is getting to be a sort of rendezvous where husbands and wives, torn apart by war, can be brought together by music.
When war broke out again, Vera began broadcasting with the BBC. Through a Forces Request programme, Sincerely Yours, she became the girl that thousands of fighting men hoped they'd meet when they returned home, although some accused the programme of damaging the war effort.
Too sentimental, making the boys homesick, and I said, that's rubbish, a lot of rubbish, I said, because the letters are so thankful for the programmes.
Vera was a star, but her desire to do more took her to meet fans halfway around the world.
So they said, well, where do you want to go? I said, well, if I'm going in, I know Europe are getting well supplied. I want to go somewhere where there isn't any entertainment. So they said, well, Burma's the only place, you know.
She kept a record of her jungle adventures in a secret diary.
I took my little diary, my little pencil, and just about see it, tiny little writing. Slept on stretcher, oh yes, balanced on 2 kitchen chairs. A rotten night, I should think so.
It's not being awarded you, you earned it. You earned it more.
It was another 40 years before Vera Lynn received her own Burma star. By then, she was Dame Vera Lynn and as busy as ever.
Am I allowed to kiss you?
In 1995, Dame Vera led the singing outside Buckingham Palace to mark the 50th anniversary of VE Day. She topped the charts, aged 93, in 2010. And on her 100th birthday, she listened to the children of her old school and remembered the singing coach who she had ignored.
When she heard me sing, she says, no, I can't train that voice. It's not a natural voice. So I said, well, thank you very much, madam, and left.
Keep smiling through, just like you always do.
Dame Vera was still with us this year as communities were tested by the current pandemic. A unifying spirit reflected on by the Queen during her recent, very personal message.
We should take comfort that while we may have more still to endure, better days will return. We will be with our friends again. We will be with our families again. We will meet again.
We meet again. Don't know where. Don't know when.
Vera Lynn was never happier than when she was with the veterans she still called my boys. The words that meant so much will survive long after they have left us.
Some sunny day.
A unifying spirit indeed, and right to the very end. Dame Vera Lynn, who died at her home in Sussex this morning at the age of 103.